Thanks very much, David, and thanks for inviting me to participate in the session today and to help introduce the discussion. As David says, I'm John Dickie. I'm a director at Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland. Some of you may know us from the work we do around social security, providing support, advice, information, training to frontline staff and advisors across Scotland in all 32 local authority areas. Or some of you might know us through some of the work we do in schools with children, young people and school communities, looking at ways of reducing cost barriers to participation at school. Or you may know us through our more general and our primary task, which is about raising awareness of child poverty and promoting evidence-based policy solutions to bring an end to that poverty in Scotland. I've been asked just to give a bit of context around where we're at with child poverty in Scotland and a few thoughts on the role of local authorities and political leaders at local level. So I'll just try and share my presentation, which I think hopefully people are seeing now. Is that working?
Yes, that's showing, John.
That's great. So yeah, I mean, just a kind of reminder of the scale and impact of child poverty in Scotland today. Latest official statistics tell us that over 1 in 5 children in Scotland are still living in poverty, living below a poverty line that in itself is less than 70% of the minimum income that the general public believe is needed for a socially acceptable standard of living. So the poverty line itself well below what people think is needed for a decent quality of life, for a minimum standard of living. Well worth reminding ourselves, many of you have heard this before, be well aware, but 70% of those children living in poverty are living in working families. This is as much a problem, an issue facing working families as it is facing those families where parents aren't able to work. It's a poverty that exists right across Scotland. We have very real higher levels of poverty in certain parts of the country, real concentrations of child poverty, but the reality is there are children living in poverty in every local authority area, in every community in Scotland, and you can see more detail on how that geography of poverty plays out on the End Child Poverty website. It's a poverty that has over the last decade or so become about increasingly acute income crisis, gone beyond just grinding day in day out struggle to make ends meet. And too often for families, as you'll know from your communities, literally not having the money to put food on the table, to pay the bills, and to get by at all, causing huge issues for children and families. It's a poverty that's been rising across the UK for the last 10, 15 years. And the primary driver of that rising child poverty has been cuts to the social security benefit support available to families, underpinned by increasingly precarious employment, and parents and carers, like others, finding that their employment doesn't provide the security and stability or adequacy of income that they need to protect their children from poverty. It's important to remember it's a poverty that pre-exists the pandemic, pre-exists the cost of living crisis, but it's a poverty that left families horribly exposed to the impact of those major events. So these have exacerbated the poverty that too many children and families were already facing. And it's a poverty that, as well as causing damage, as we'll come on and talk about a wee bit, to children themselves, has a huge cost for all of us, for the Scottish economy, for Scottish society as a whole. Been estimated that the economic cost is around £2.3 billion a year in Scotland alone. The costs of picking up the pieces of that poverty and the lost contributions that children, the adults who grew up in poverty, can make to our economy in the future. think also, and really important when thinking about child poverty at a local level as well as at a national level, is understanding who are those children, who are the children that are still growing up in poverty in Scotland today. And we know very clearly that there are some children that are even greater risk of poverty. So children growing up in families affected by disability, particularly at risk of poverty. And as well as being at greater risk, they make up a big proportion of all children living in poverty. So over half of children living in poverty in Scotland are living in families affected by disability. Higher risk of poverty where children are growing up in lone parent families, 1 in 3 of those children growing up in poverty. Higher risk of poverty when they're in larger families. Higher risk of poverty in families with a child under 1 with babies. And a particularly high risk of poverty for children in minority ethnic households, nearly half of those children growing up in poverty. So that's really important in terms of thinking about what is needed, what are the kind of responses that are needed to ensure that we make progress or we act on child poverty. I mean, you'll know much of this directly from your work in your communities, but the impact of child poverty on education, on health, is clear. Just a couple of examples here. We know that children growing up in the lowest income households are almost 4 times more likely to have fair, bad, or very bad health compared to those children growing up in the highest income families. They're 4 times as likely to have poorer mental well-being as those growing up in families with higher incomes. In terms of education, we know that poverty has an impact from the very beginning. By age 5, there's a gap of 10 months in problem-solving abilities, and in 13 months in vocabulary development. And that kind of impact too often actually becomes greater as children go through school rather than being reduced. So by the time we see S2 pupils, we see them in areas of lower deprivation. They're twice as likely to be performing well on numeracy as those in more deprived areas. So very real impact on children's education and health outcomes. But it's not just that kind of measurable impact on education and health. Just worth reminding ourselves how this feels for children. These are just a few quotes from children and young people who've been involved in work we've done in schools, just kind of giving a sense of how children end up feeling excluded, stigmatized, left out, bullied in some cases as a result of the poverty, the lack of income that their families are experiencing. So it can seem quite a bleak picture, I suppose, and a picture that's kind of feels like we've been here for a long time. But I think it's also really, really important to remind ourselves that progress is and has been made, that there's absolutely nothing inevitable about these levels of child poverty. And particularly encouraging, we've seen in the last few years real impact and a real shift in child poverty patterns. So in Scotland, we saw child poverty fall from 26% of children to 22% in the most recent year for which we have data, from 2022-23 to 23-24. So that's a 4 percentage point reduction in levels of child poverty in Scotland at a time when child poverty actually increased across the rest of the UK, continued to increase across the rest of the UK. So significant reduction in child poverty in Scotland. And a pattern, that's the national figure, but we look at local child poverty figures, the estimates we have at local level, and we see child poverty falling across most of Scotland's local authorities. And there's no question that fall is the result of devolved policies that have been brought in, supported by all the political parties. And in particular, the key policy that's driven that progress has been the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment and subsequent increases to the value of that payment. So policies really are making a difference at national level, but those policies have also been supported by action at local level. I think there's clear evidence coming through from local child poverty action reports that child poverty is increasingly being prioritised at local level, with local partners taking on increasingly joined up strategic approaches to child poverty. I know just from talking to people and kind of listening to what's going on, that the level of priority, awareness of, priority attached to, and action being taken to specifically tackle child poverty has improved significantly, increased significantly over the last few years. And we see that making a very real difference to both the experience of individual children and families, but also helping to support that downward push on the overall child poverty rates. What's, I think, sat behind that progress has been a very clear, increasingly clear shared understanding of what the drivers of child poverty are. Income from employment or lack of income from employment, income from social security, the inadequacy of social security, the costs that families face, particularly housing costs, are all are the three key drivers that have impacted on the rising levels of child poverty we saw up until recently. And it's very specific policies to tackle those three drivers that are now seeing us seeing a position where child poverty has started to come down in Scotland. So that shared understanding of those drivers of child poverty, of what actually causes child poverty, and then developing policies that tackle those drivers has been absolutely key. Having said all that, there's no question that there's still very real challenges. There's still a big distance left to travel. The national child poverty targets to reduce child poverty to less than 1 in 10 as the headline measure by 2030. The target to reduce child poverty, the interim target to reduce child poverty to less than 18% was missed. And the analysis is that the current policy package, looking at what's happening at national level, looking at what's happening at local level, falls far short of what's needed to meet the 2030 target of less than 10% of children living in poverty. So we've seen very real progress, very real action that's reducing the levels of child poverty, but not yet at a scale or at a pace that actually comes close to meeting the targets that all the political parties at Holyrood committed to through the Child Poverty Act. Another big challenge is that UK policy continues to actively increase levels of child poverty. The 2-child limit alone pushing over 100 children into poverty each day across the UK. I think another challenge has been thinking in terms of at local level, as though we've seen very real action on child poverty at a local level, real understanding, awareness, increased understanding, that we're perhaps not yet seeing child poverty and the need to tackle child poverty inform all the local housing, economic development, transport policies and budget decisions that are being made locally. So that's a kind of challenge, but I think also an opportunity in terms of thinking ahead, what more can be done locally to support further action on child poverty. So thinking in terms of some of those opportunities, we have the UK government committed to bringing forward a child poverty strategy by the end of this year at the very latest. We've been waiting for a while, but that commitment to bring forward a child poverty strategy and a commitment to tackle child poverty. We've got the next Scottish child poverty delivery plan actively being developed at the moment. And I think thinking in terms of both that UK strategy, Scottish strategy, there's an opportunity here to really think about a greater focus on the role of local action and the contribution it can make, and the relationships that there need to be between local government, Scottish government and UK government to make maximum impact on those on those barriers that families are facing, preventing them from moving out of poverty or trapping them in poverty, particularly thinking in terms of policies around childcare, around housing, around employment and economic development, around transport, around education, and around welfare rights advice. So I think a real opportunity to think about what is the role within these Scottish and UK strategies for local action in order to make further progress. Also, I think an opportunity in the Scottish parliamentary elections. I know this is we're thinking in terms of local action, but even when there's a national election, the opportunity to raise awareness of the progress that's been made, to understand what's actually working to reduce child poverty, but to build on that and do more is an important opportunity, and an opportunity to kind of refresh and maintain that cross-party consensus that we've had in Scotland that's backed the commitment to tackling child poverty, that's backed the introduction and the investment in policies like the Scottish Child Payment at national level that have actively reduced child poverty. Just want to kind of finish off with a few thoughts on what are the ingredients, what is needed to ensure further progress. I kind of took this slide as a generic slide I've used before, even though it wasn't sort of focused specifically in terms of thinking about local action. But I suppose what jumped out at me was that whilst the first two actions there, the first two calls that we as CPAG and many others are making to ensure further practice are very much national Scottish Government policies that need to be delivered. The others all are all areas where local government can have a big impact. But at national level, there's absolutely no question that there's no credible route to meeting the 2030 child poverty targets. There's no way we can significantly reduce child poverty further in Scotland without making further investment in the social security support that remains inadequate for too many families. So the need to double at the least the child payment by the end of the next Parliament, and to deliver on that two-child mitigation in Scotland. Hopefully we'll see abolition of the two-child limit at UK level, which then can free up resources here in Scotland for further investment up here. But more broadly, we need to make sure that families are actually getting the financial support they're entitled to, and thinking about the priority families. We know that, for example, Black and minority ethnic families are less likely to be taking up benefits entitlements. And yet they're at particular risk of child poverty. So there's things we need to think about there in terms of how we're ensuring all families, all children, and particularly those at most risk of poverty, are getting the financial supports that they're entitled to. We need to continue to look at not just developing an investment in affordable housing generally, but actually making sure there's a clear focus on family housing, that the housing that we're investing in is housing that meets the needs of children, low-income families with children. We need to look at childcare provision and continue to look at how we can expand childcare offer for families, particularly for families struggling on low incomes, so that they can access the employment opportunities that are available, but also ensure that their children are getting access to really good early learning opportunities. Absolutely key to this will be about improving employment opportunities for parents and carers, and thinking about what's the role at a local level of ensuring employability schemes are supporting parents and carers, removing the barriers that parents and carers face in terms of moving into and improving their position in the labour market, but also thinking about the quality of jobs at local level and what more can happen at local level to ensure that the kinds of jobs that are being created within local communities are the kinds of jobs that provide stable, secure incomes for those with caring responsibilities as well. And finally, need for action to continue to look at where can we reduce the costs that families face, not just the housing costs and the childcare costs, but the broader costs that families face, including costs at school, and the role that local authorities can play in supporting schools to reduce the cost barriers that too often prevent children from participating and getting the most out of the education system. I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll kind of pause there, but really just conclude by saying, whilst there are very real challenges, not least funding charities challenges, I think there are very real opportunities for local government to be making a substantive contribution to the further progress that will be needed to reach that point where no child's living in poverty, and make substantive year-on-year progress towards that. If we can ensure that all local policy decisions, particularly decisions around economic development, around housing, around transport, are proofed and tested for the impact they're having on those three drivers of child poverty, I think that can take us a long way. Absolutely no question in my mind that the progress that's been made in Scotland on child poverty in recent years has been driven by and underpinned by political leadership. The role that the politicians at local and national level can play in pushing and leading on the issue of child poverty has been absolutely critical. And I'm very keen just to see that continue, both at national but also at local level. I'll pause there. I hope that's given a bit of a sense of a context from a CPAG perspective. As I say, just I suppose we've seen, I think, a huge shift over the last decade, a huge increase in awareness of child poverty, real progress, both at local and at national level, but still a long way to go, but lots of opportunities to be doing things even better.
Many thanks, David, and certainly much of what I'm going to say will reinforce the points that John's just made. I want to start, however, by moving beyond the topic that's in hand, and I want to thank you for the work that you do as elected members. I know that these are fractious times in the UK, and that sometimes the level of abuse that you have to endure is something that's intolerable. And just the general work that you do as elected members is appreciated, I think, by the vast majority of the general public. Local action matters is a point that John has made, and a point that I really want to emphasise here, that while some of the really big ticket issues that will really transform the tackling of poverty in our country, Scotland and the rest of the UK, they do rest with the UK government. The big issues to do with taxation, the big issues to do with welfare, most of that rests at Westminster. There is a lot of work that can be done, has been done, must be done, and is being done locally. So the work that you do matters in terms of the leadership, as well as what your officers are able to enact. And one thing that I'm going to try to get across in the next 10 minutes is there's been a proliferation of local innovation across Scotland, making a difference at how local citizens are supported or enabled to tackle poverty in Scotland. Few general words about my unit, the unit that I'm part of. Now, I'm an academic, and academics sometimes very fairly are criticised from being a little bit distant from the contemporary reality of folks' lives in Scotland, but that I'm part of the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Research Unit. We like to see ourselves as something different. We like to really present ourselves as a support act, if you like, a resource for the third sector and for local government to provide that intelligence and awareness and research support that enables you to do better what you're already doing in terms of tackling poverty. So we very much are wrapped up in the realities of what's going on the ground, both locally and nationally, tackling poverty in Scotland. Yesterday I had and I'll go on to say a little bit more about this. Yesterday I hosted a meeting at Caledonian University with the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, where we were brought together 5 different local operators across Scotland, some from the third sector, from Dawson, the diaspora organisation supporting African women, from Aberlour charity, from Above Adventure, so 3 from the third sector in East Ayrshire, in Glasgow and throughout Scotland in terms of Aberlour that are doing local work to tackle poverty, but also child poverty leads from Perth and Kinross and from Inverclyde Council. And we had the opportunity to discuss with the Cabinet Secretary the range of local work that's going on in Scotland and how that is making a difference to that broader national joint endeavour of tackling poverty in Scotland. And while our focus often is child poverty, I think the other thing that we have to acknowledge is that while it's vitally important that we deal with child poverty, that poverty is a general problem, and there are subpopulations over and above children that can't be forgotten in terms of the local work we have to do. So let me take you on an historical journey. Promise you it's not going to be academic. Go back to 2010. The UK government legislated to eradicate child poverty by 2020. In 2012, the unit, Stephen Sinclair and I, produced a short report in 2012, 2 years after that 2010 commitment, where we surveyed chief executives and council leaders in each of Scotland's 32 authorities to find out what the thinking was back in 2012 about local action to tackle child poverty. Because in that iteration of our national child poverty strategy, the 2010 UK strategy, Scotland didn't have local commitments to tackle child poverty. There was an obligation in the 2010 Act for English local authorities to have an English plan, but that was not something that Scotland had opted into in 2010. Move fast forward to 2016, and then there is the withdrawal of the commitments in the 2010 Act to eradicate child poverty in the UK. And 1 year hence, in 2017, the landmark here in Scotland, the Scottish Government reintroduced that commitment in Scotland that by 2030, with a new time frame, we would eradicate child poverty in Scotland. And a point that John's made, I think, is a really important point for us to note, certainly with elected members, is that despite the fact that that was withdrawn at a UK level, in Scotland, there was universal support across the political spectrum for this national joint endeavour to tackle child poverty. So that was one thing I think that's really important. It was a collective agreement that this was something that everybody agreed we should do in Scotland. And a second important point is that in 2017, we introduced those local commitments, a local obligation, if we're honest, but a local partnership that tackling child poverty in Scotland was not just the responsibility of the Scottish Government and the UK Government, but it was also the responsibility of local authorities jointly with local NHS health boards. So what happened after 2017 was that the focus in sharpening, or a sharpening of focus on the local action to tackle child poverty. As you are well aware, there was an obligation placed on each of your authorities then to produce an annual local child poverty action report. We're now in the 7th iteration of those reports. Those reports then not only describe what's been done, but describe what will be done in terms of tackling poverty locally, telling the story, but also, I think, being a catalyst to more local action. And indeed, in the very first review of these local child poverty action reports, the 32 reports from that first year, the then chair of the head of the Poverty and Equality Commission challenged those that were supporting local areas to find a way of better sharing the learning from that innovation that was taking place. Bill Scott, who then was the chair of the Poverty and Equality Commission, acknowledged that 2017 Act had stimulated even more local action to tackle poverty, but he was concerned that the learning from that was not being shared effectively. Basically, the opportunities from learning from each other were being lost as each area was driving forward with their own local plan. Well, the unit at that stage then, we took that message to heart, and we secured some money from a charitable trust to develop a tackling child poverty locally directory. And that's just what I want to say a few words about today. I'll put it on the screen in a minute. And to some extent, it's a pat in the back for local areas. I'd mentioned that the Cabinet Secretary yesterday came across the Caledonian, and she didn't just come across because it was Challenge Poverty Week and she happened to be in Glasgow at another event. She came across because that directory now has 100 examples. 100 examples from the third sector, from local government, from local NHS boards, from social enterprises, from national charities and from local community groups that are doing a range of different things to make a difference locally in tackling poverty. And your officers in local government then have played a big part in contributing to that shared national endeavour. And what we're doing in that directory is we're not just telling people what's being done, we're showing them how they could do it as well. And certainly, what was certainly the case yesterday, that Margaret Lynch, who's one of the child poverty leads in Perth and Kinross, and Louise McVeigh, who's the child poverty lead in Inverclyde, were explaining how that directory was used by local officers to both contact local officers from other authorities that were doing innovative things that they wanted to learn from, as well as learning from that practice that was already there. We'll just say what's been done, but we put a big to guide that would enable others to adopt similar initiatives in their own area if they wanted. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the directive. I thought it might be quite useful for me just to put it on screen. And he says, hoping the technology will work with bated breath. Let me see. That's not what I want to share. Let me see. Hopefully this will be right. Yeah, here we are. So this is the Tackling Poverty Directory. You can put in any word, you can put in places, you can put in topics. Let me just put in, let's see, stigma. So I type in the word stigma. We click the button. And up pops, in this case, 17 examples of different local work across Scotland that's tackling stigma in different ways. Now, I'm not going to go through them all, but you'll just go through the first few that pop up. So Think Poverty by Falkirk Council, raising awareness of the impact of poverty. And this is just the cover page that allows us to identify what local actions we might be interested in. Here, the Think Poverty scheme was bringing together different council officers to make them more aware of how their approach to delivering services might have an impact and how the quality of that service is actually received and delivered and designed in the Falkirk area. The Fife Stigma Toolkit, challenging poverty stigma and informing best practice at local level. Falkirk's back up again, then Midlothian peer research, a case for change through a place-based approach, building skills and influencing, and so on and so on. When we have these case studies, then if we go in for a bit more detail, that's just a headline description. But what we have then for the case studies is a very detailed breakdown of what they're all about, so that it's a very efficient way of council officers finding out what's going on in other parts of Scotland and thinking about whether that's something that they might adapt, because it's not just simply a case of adopting, of course. Our 32 local authorities are very different in scale and in population character. We need to think about how they'd be applied in an area. But this provides the information that allows a shortcut. I won't go into it. The key point we have in the directory is a how-to guide. So it's a detailed document coming to 20 or 30 pages. It provides all the information, financial and staffing, as well as the decisions that have to be made if we want to introduce these innovations across Scotland. So the point I'm trying to make is you deserve a pat in the back, local areas. It's a pernicious problem, but it's a problem that Scotland's 32 local authorities are making a difference. And I think it's really important to emphasise that, because it can sometimes feel as if our efforts are worthless. If the big numbers aren't shifting as much as we would like in terms of this effort that we're putting into tackling poverty, then it's not always the case that is the fault of the local areas. Now, John is right. There is absolutely more we can do locally and more that we should be doing locally. But some of the factors, yeah, we'll put a link in there, Fiona. Thanks very much. I'll also put a link into the 2012 report into the chat as well, just for historical reference. But it's not always a case then that that we should be blamed, or indeed your local officers should be blamed for not making a difference in tackling poverty. Because much of the very good work that's in that directory and that is happening in your 32 authorities is taking the edge off poverty. Now, that's not what we want ultimately. We want to prevent people falling into poverty. We want to reduce the number of people that are living in poverty. But we should also acknowledge the power of good work that's done locally and just making lives that little bit better, that little bit more dignified, that little bit easier for people who are experiencing poverty, and maybe the prospects of that leaving poverty are not immediately relevant. Local work is making a difference, and I would applaud you for the work that's doing, but I'd also ask you to push a little bit harder, as John does, to make sure that we do absolutely all we can do with our local resources to tackle poverty. Now, I know that very often what happens in local areas is you're picking up the pieces, that some of the decisions that are made at a national level, be it Scottish or UK, have implications in terms of the demands of the local population, or indeed the resource that local areas have to deal with that. But notwithstanding these realities, I think there are still lots of things we can do to make ourselves work more effectively and to acknowledge that work that's going on and provide that political leadership that, I guess, reinforces not just our local officers, but I think others in our local area, that what they are doing is valued, important, and is part of what we view our country and our local areas to be. And just a very final point, that these local child poverty action reports, which, as I say, have led to a proliferation of action and a sharpening of focus, many of them now are developing into whole population reports. So the reports are about tackling poverty as a whole in the area, but they also have a very specific lens of what has to be done to tackle child poverty too, meeting the requirements, the obligations of the 2017 Act for local areas to report on it, but acknowledging that there are other populations in our areas that are deserving of support too. So I'm really grateful for your time and allowing me to share some thoughts with you. I'll pop that directory in the chat with the 2012 report, and really happy to answer any questions as David suggests. Thanks, David.
A bit of background as to what my role is and the kind of learning that we've garnered from our work with local government over the last few years. So when I came into post in this role about 7 years ago, just as the Child Poverty Act was being embedded, and my role was very much around working with local government including health boards and wider community planning partners of councils, to embed that duty to produce these annual local child poverty action reports, and to ensure that they were instruments that didn't just list activity that was happening locally, that they weren't just bits of paper that sat on a shelf, but that they were instruments to really drive change and transform lives, essentially. And in providing that support to local government, we work really, really closely with other national organisations, a few of whom are represented today. So we work very closely with the Scottish Government, with Public Health Scotland, with the Poverty Alliance, with COSLA as well, to make sure that we're providing a kind of joined up package of support to local government. And so that includes things like running a peer support network for officers that are working locally to tackle child poverty. There's also a rural support network. And another big part of what we do is, when these annual local child poverty action reports are published, they're sent to me at the Improvement Service, and they're divvied up amongst some of those national partners. Those national partners read the reports, and we have a set form that we all work through to pull out examples of good practice, areas where we think there's a need for more information, and that informs these one-to-one discussions with local areas to provide feedback on the local reports. And this isn't intended to be like marking the homework or anything like that. They're very constructive discussions, and they're really an opportunity for officers to learn about what's happening in other areas and to access some of the support that's available at national level. And as well as providing that feedback, that process of reading the local child poverty action reports and pulling out practice is used to provide an annual light touch analysis of what's in the local child poverty action reports. I'm not sure if you can access the link on that slide, but if not, I'll make sure it's circulated. So that document does include local examples. And when we come across a good example, we always make sure to send it to John at Spyro so that they can do that more in-depth piece of getting the detail behind these examples of good practice. So we've been working very closely with local government on child poverty for a long time. And I must say, from looking at last year's local child poverty action reports and comparing those to the ones that have come before, particularly comparing them to the ones in year one, there really has been incredible progress in terms of what we're seeing. The reports are increasingly strategic. They're often multi-agency reports. They're linked expressly to wider local plans, to LOIPs, to children's services plans, and often they're multi-year approaches. So instead of just being a child poverty annual report, we see a 5-year tackling poverty or tackling child poverty strategy with light touch annual reports to satisfy the legislative duty. But it's really, they're much more about driving change, I think, than describing action than they used to be, which is great. They're using data to make sure that the resources are targeted towards the areas, to the groups that need them most. We're increasingly seeing that use of data and engagement with the voice of lived experience. We're seeing stronger partnership working, particularly with health, but also with the third sector and even the private sector in some cases, big private sector employers. And we're increasingly seeing that joined up approach to service delivery. So the no wrong door approach, and making sure people don't fall down cracks between services. So a really positive story. I think we have to caveat that with the fact that there are some areas where, from a national perspective, and it's very easy to say these things from a national perspective, we would like to see more development. And so if you look at this slide, this highlights the areas where we see local reports taking a really strong strategic approach to tackling child poverty. So what are the policy delivery and service delivery areas that we're seeing coming through? So income max is very strong, employability is very strong, delivery of benefits is also strong, childcare quite strong, housing, transport, procurement, community wealth building, those big structural levers we're not necessarily seeing come through the reports in the way that we'd like to. And I think the key messages that we've garnered from looking at the reports is just in terms of areas for improvement going forward, that real need to prioritise prevention. I think the statistics that John Dickie shared about the impact that poverty has on all aspects of a child's life, of a family's life, it's not something that is going to be fixed by responding to that immediate crisis need alone, as you all know. And I know you all know this, but it's about driving strategic change so that parents can access meaningful, well-paid employment. They can have affordable transport to drop their child off at nursery when they need to work, you know, and that's all about things like planning, housing, these big levers. So I think seeing that coming through more strongly is something that to aim for. And again, the next point's been touched on already, but understanding that the change we're making, so not just focusing on those headline child poverty measures, but having a kind of framework that sits underneath that and a real line of sight to say that, okay, if we want incomes to increase and cost of living to go down, what are the things that we can do locally and how will we know if they're working? So that kind of framework of sort of proportionate framework of indicators that might measure things like, is uptake of childcare amongst eligible twos high enough, is it increasing? Are local employers paying the living wage? And you know, working back from that objective to those measurable things and including the voice of lived experience and the voice of officers in our understanding of what's working. Because what I hear from officers when, you know, through the child poverty network is quite often that when they're reporting to council and they feel a pressure to be able to show the impact that they're having, and I think that sometimes manifests as a pressure to present numbers. And quite often that means that they end up presenting and highlighting the frontline activities that they're doing, where we can count the number of people that, you know, received advice, etc. And it's more difficult to measure those longer term strategic areas like housing, like transport, like economic development. So I think, as John's already said, when we're thinking about progress, having a broad mind and patience in terms of looking at that bigger piece, and as already been touched upon, maintaining the focus on the priority groups. If we're not reaching those 90% of households that are in a priority group with a policy, there's a good chance it's not working to tackle child poverty. So we used all that evidence and all that interaction with officers to develop that elected members briefing that pulls out a few key actions for elected members. So I'm just going to run through them really quickly. I'm very conscious of time. A lot of them have been mentioned already, which is reassuring, to be honest. But so elected members could be even more, and I know you're all doing this already, but championing the need for those joined up preventative approaches when developing and policy around child poverty. Ensure the needs of priority parents are being considered in relation to strategic planning, budget decisions, housing, transport, etc., not just the frontline service delivery. Keeping looking beyond child poverty rates when we're thinking about understanding impact. There's also a role for elected members, of course, in sometimes scrutinising those local child poverty action reports once they've been developed. And so that's another opportunity to ensure that robust long-term preventative approach is being taken to tackling child poverty, and bringing that lens, that preventative lens as well to other roles, whether that's you know, leading on a portfolio or on the board of within a NHS health board. I know you all wear many hats. So really taking that message far and wide about tackling the root causes of child poverty rather than tackling its symptoms. So I'll stop there.